Thank you very much, Deacon Betokun. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for all of you for joining us in this presentation. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about my new book. We've done a lot of series about why Africa cannot feed itself. And we said it's one of the greatest challenges that we have in our time, especially now that the war in Ukraine and Russia is affecting our food production in Africa. Africa that used to be able to produce food for itself, Africa that was able to produce food was able to produce during the slavery in America, Africa that was able to produce enough raw materials during colonialism. Now, the same Africa is now a country that cannot self-sufficient and produce food for itself. So today we've been looking at why Africa cannot feed itself. Today we're going to look at what ancient Africa knew about farming. I believe this is very, very important. But before we go too far, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my books that I've written. This is Profitable Pig Farming. It's a pig, they refer to it as pig, the Blue Pig Bible. It has been read by many people around the world, and if you want to check some of the feedback they've given, you can go to Amazon.com and you will see some of the feedback that people have given from Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Africa, from Cameroon to United Kingdom to United States to Canada. There's been positive feedback, and a lot of people are finding it very useful. The second book I want to talk about is what ancient Africa knew and how their work influenced modern life. I believe this is a book that every parent and every family should get, especially if you have children. And every child between the age of 12 to 25 must read it as a school curriculum to prepare them for the future. Because we live in a world whereby if you don't know who you are and what your people have done, people will tell you a wrong story and people will look down on you. And we said earlier that if you know your history, it helps to build up your resilience, especially when you are faced with challenges or situations where you cannot solve with your present knowledge. You need to know that you are from an elaborate culture, that your forefathers have survived difficult and tough situations, and as a result, you too have what it takes to survive and to overcome. So we talk about it in details. I would recommend you buy the book. The last one that I'm looking at today is why Africa cannot feed itself. As I said earlier, we've had about 4 series on this. So if you have not seen this, please try and you can buy the book. Buy the book is very, very important, because what we try to do in this video session is to try and just give you a foretaste. And one of the things that people have said about black people is that black people don't read. And it's quite amazing that if you can't read, people that read lead. So while I'm happy to share the rudiments of the books with you on video, I would recommend you buy the book and spend some time to read it. And if you want to buy audiobook, read it so you can understand. And you can tell stories to your children, to your children's children. I was saying in God Almighty, when he wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis chapter 17, he said, these things I'm about to do, I cannot do it without telling my servant Abraham. And the question is, why is God interested in telling his servant Abraham? He said, because I know that Abraham is going to become a father of many nations. And he's going to teach his children. So almost is upon us as parents to teach our children our history so they can be well prepared for the future that lies ahead of them. And for you in Africa, if your children, I believe your children at some point are going to leave the shore of Africa, and have to go and study or to go and work. And when they do, you will discover that even the language, the culture of Africa that many of we parents are trying to make our children not to pick up are going to be the backbone, their backbone when they travel out. If not, take my word for it. I've been out of the country for the last 30 years, so I know what I'm talking about. Now, we're going to be looking at the history of farming in Africa. This is very important because earlier on in some of our videos and in our book, we've talked about most of the empire that existed in Africa. And we say that the Egyptian Empire is one of the ones that everybody is familiar with, one of the biggest. It's the oldest. It was established 2,000 years before Greek was established and before 2,500 before Roman Empire. And we say that is, however, we say that's not the only civilization that's happened in Africa. We say that there are also other civilizations that were taking place in Africa. We talk about the Ethiopian Empire, Nubia Empire, Askum Empire. We talk about the Great Zimbabwe. We talk about Mali Empire, Ghana Empire, Songhai Empire, the Benin Empire, the Oyo Empire, the Empire of Canaan. We spend a lot of time. You find a lot of details about this ancient civilization in our book. So the kingdom of Nubia, which is like present Sudan, is huge and big. The kingdom of Askum, which is the present Ethiopia and Yemen, has been existing as the only place where Solomonic tribe have lasted without being broken for the last 3,000 years. 1,000 before the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ and 2,000 years plus. And we also talk about the Great Zimbabwe Empire. We talk about Benin Empire. And we talk about Mali Empire. And we also talk about Oyo Empire, the Ashanti Empire, the Songhai. Now, what is peculiar about this empire? We also talk about different kind of structure that were in this empire. So people begin to know that Africa is not just, we don't live on trees, we don't live on trees, and we wear clothes. We have empire, we have structures that are built thousands of years before when European was still in the Dark Ages, when the European was still having the bubonic plague, when they still dying of pestilence and disease, Africa has developed. And like I said, this is not to despise anybody. It's an historical fact that is written everywhere for people that want to read it. Now the question is that how can this empire survive? Definitely, you're going to have empire that is this big. You need your food production must be solid, because you can't have 2,000, 3,000, 10,000, 100,000 people in a place without having good food sustenance ability. And how is it that they're able to sustain themselves and expand themselves with time? Because some of the size of this empire are bigger than even the half of bigger than some of them are as big as half of Europe. So we started looking at the brief history of farming generally. We said all human beings started as hunter-gatherer. That is, they go about and pick fruits. So the men will go out and pick fruits and go and hunt, and the women will go and pick fruits. And that's how human beings started, picking fruits. But with time, they discovered that it's getting more and more difficult to get wild fruit. It's becoming more unpredictable, and they have to walk longer to be able to pick fruits. And that's why I believe that Africa needs to look deep and tap into that ability to be able to produce food, as our forefathers have been able to do. Now, why did human beings move from hunter-gatherer to farming? Basically, the whole goal of farming was to ensure that 1 acre of field can feed more people. Why is this becoming? Because it's because we are used to farming. If you want to go and survive on wild, if you go to the wild where there's no farming, you discover that when you eat a fruit here, you might have to travel 2 or 3 months before you find another fruit. And basically, because though there are lots of plants everywhere, only 10% of the plants that are on earth are digestible. The rest are indigestible. Some of them are poisonous. Some of them are dead cat trap, like some mushroom. Now, hunter-gatherers discovered that they are having to travel miles and cover miles before they eat food, and finding food is not more regular. And that changes. You have to realize, if you're a wife of a hunter-gatherer, that because you know that you're going to need to keep on moving, your lifetime must be that you can only have a kid every 5 years. Because you know that you'll be moving very soon, and you have to carry the baby and all your belongings with you. The hunter-gatherer tend to space their children every 5 years to allow them to be able to cope. So the child will be walking before they give back to another one. And they achieve this through prolonged lactation, sexual abstinence, just to make sure the child do not come as frequently. Now, as one being begins to settle down to farming, women's giving birth to children become more close, become 2 years. People, because they come together, and because they come together, there is economy of scale. So more and more food is being produced, and as a result, people don't need to need to be more fixed abode. And as the population increases, the food surplus increases, and then come the need for storage. With the need for storage, then become the need for rulers. Somebody has to distribute the food, and there's need for warriors. Somebody has to protect the food, and there's a need for trader, because if you produce something and I want something else, somebody has to be able to trade. And that's how traders and a community develop. And that's the community that that's the era that the Africa developed into. Now, one of the advantages of community is it frees more people. So instead of everybody becoming a farmer, it becomes very easy for people to specialize in other things. So they are craftsmen that were able to, they don't have to farm. They only need to do their craft and do crafting and specialize into other things, because they need to make bows and arrows that they can have more equipment to be able to fight off the enemy and go and conquer another enemy. Now, history, according to John Henry Clark, is that history is not everything. It is a starting point. History is important because it is a clock that tells people their political, their cultural, and historical times of the day. History is a compass that wise people use to locate themselves on the map of world. A people's history tells them who they are, where they have been, where they are now, but most importantly, where they must still go. That's John Henry Clark. History is not everything, but it is a starting point. The history is important because it is a clock that tells people their political, cultural, and historical times. History is the compass, and wise people used to locate themselves on the map of the world. A people's history tells them who they are, where they have been, where they are now, but most importantly, where they must still go. John Henry Clark. Now, when Africa started, Africa operated more as a culture than a civilization before the 15th century. The word culture is a Latin word, means colere, which means to till, to grow, and to nurture, and to cultivate the earth. African perspective about civilization is different from the capitalist one that the Europe imbibed. Africa believed that this world belongs to all, and it needs to be taken care of, it needs to be nurtured. Very similar to what God said in the book of Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, whereby God commanded man. The Bible says God blessed and said to man, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So African attitude to nature was like that from the beginning of creation. Now, what's the implication of that? Let's define culture. Culture is a characteristic knowledge and way of life of a particular group of people. It incorporates the language, the religion, the cuisine, the social habit, capabilities, and habits of the individual in this group. What they wore, the way they walked, and how they treat death and greeted newborn. That's from Chinua Achebe. Let me take the definition of culture again from Chinua Achebe. He said the culture in Africa is the characteristic knowledge and way of life of a particular group of people. It incorporates the language, the religion, the cuisine, the social habits, the music and art. Culture also embraces people's beliefs, laws, custom, capabilities, and habits of the individual in this group. What they wore, the way they walked and talked, and how they treated death and the arrival of a newborn baby. That's from Chinua Achebe. The same culture of Africa, the same approach and perspective to this kind of approach to nature is similar to what was practiced in Inca civilization in North America before 1400, before the exposure to European. Actually, Emperor Caesar one of the great emperor of Rome, show his admiration for Africa, he exclaimed, "Ex Africa semper aliquid novi." Don't mind my Latin. Basically, what it means is out of Africa is always something new. Now, the reason what we are doing now is that when we look at all these gigantic civilizations in Africa, what we are trying to do now is to look at the backbone, what made it work. How do people interact? Because if there's any area in the history of black people that is not very clear to many people, to even black people, let alone to people, to other culture, is the state of Africa before 1400, before the encounter with the Europeans. Because there are many distorted views that African people were savages, they were living on trees, they are not wearing clothes, but it cannot be more wrong, as we have seen in the civilization. So what we are trying to do, we talk about the civilization, we look at the helicopter view. Now we are trying to look at the day-to-day activity of these people. How do they run this? How do they run this? How do they run and sustain this society? Which I believe is very, very important. Now, African music, to start with, music and dance played vital role in the culture of Africa. At birth, at initiation, and marriage and death. Every language and tribe in Africa has their drum, their percussion, and their rhythm. Very interesting. Because that's why in Africa, it's very easy. It's people, wherever African is, music always follow them. And it's very interesting how African music black African music have taken over many music in different parts of the world. Because music is part of Africa. African principal social relations are associated with communalism. Africa does not practice communism. Africa practices communalism. African music and art set it apart from other culture in the world, and it's linked to religion. The religion view of Africa sets society's superstructure originating from the degree of control. Basically, all African. I was looking at the recent study done by Pew. They said even as late as 2021, 70 to 80% of Africa still pray to God, still fast, and that's very peculiar to Africa. Religion view of Africa sets society apart. African religion, however, led to poor attitude to scientific and metaphysical law, which made imbibing new technology to be very slow. The tendency of religion to persist unchanged for extremely long period made Africa not to develop in terms of technology like all that like the Europeans. For example, when Africa see a big mountain, it rather go and take the little earth and worship the mountain. Whereas if a capitalist Europe saw a mountain, want to break to the mountain and extract whatever is in it and take it away. Africa prayed for rain instead of doing irrigation. And when there was shortage of rain or drought in those days, a lot of people always die. African attitude to religion make it very susceptible to Islam and Christianity, which was one of the tools that was used to take it to slavery and to colonize it. African principle of social relation was associated with communalism, not communism. The way Africa operates was communalism, which means every member, from the time you are born, you have your position, you have your right to land, or you have to have your duties and your obligation. Farming was the main occupation, and land was owned by family. So basically, when you are born, your family will own the land. Even when you move to a part, you are born, you have a land that belongs to you from your family. As a result, in Africa, the head of the family was responsible for the land on behalf of the family. So the firstborn of the elders, their role is to make sure that they share the land equitably and make sure everybody is entitled to land, because nobody is allowed to go on to bed hungry in Africa. There's a saying in Africa that it takes a village to raise a child. The idea behind it is that every family has a plot. every individual family has a plot, and which they're entitled to cultivate. But not only that, they also have joint responsibility to farm together and cultivate either cash crop, or to do hunting, or to do fishing. Age was the most important factor in determining the extent of right. So the older you are, the more right you have, the more responsibility you have. Circumcision is one of the means of initiating you to society and adulthood. Let's look at how, when the first Europeans saw African community, let's look at how they describe it. This was from a Portuguese ship captain, Lourenço Pinto. He said Benin was larger than Lisbon, wealthy, industrial, and well-governed, to the extent that there was no theft. The level of security was such that people had no doors in their houses. It shows that people were content. No, that was from a Portuguese ship captain. That's how he perceived when he, for his first time in Africa, before the slavery. That's how he perceived Africa, as a place where people are content. They don't need to steal. Everybody is taken care of. Nobody is going with an empty tummy. Everybody has enough. There's no covetousness. People are not overly. Some people are not overly rich, and some people are overly poor. Everybody was just content. So there's no need for them to lock their door, because what you have is what I have. And what you have is your food to eat and your farm, and there's no need to have it all. He said another one, Alfred Dapper is a Dutch writer. He said Benin City is at least 4 miles wide. The city has wide and straight road, lined by houses. The houses are large and handsome, with walls made from clay. The people are very friendly. There seems to be no stealing. It's quite interesting that all these Europeans, one of the things that struck them was theft. Because you have to realize, during these periods, or during the period of Oliver Twist in London, for example, when theft and prostitution was very rampant, even in London. And here we are in the city of Benin during that period, where there was no even need for doors. There's no beggar. Everybody was content. Everybody was well fed. Now, slavery. Somebody talk about slavery. Slavery do happen around this time. And it's very important for us to divide slavery from African point of view and from Arab slavery or from transatlantic slavery. In Africa, like in every other culture, when a tribe fight and you win a battle, you take some people in captive. But there's an unwritten law in Africa that when you win a community, you imbibe them. They were slaves for a while, and you absorb them into your community. And the children and themselves within a short time have the right to even lead the country if they have the skill or the expertise to be able to do so. So it was when the Arab came that things started changing for negative regarding slavery in Africa. We're going to look at that in the next episode. What the Arab did in terms of introducing slavery into Africa for a long time. Now, African farmers understand the ecology, the total ecology of the land. They understand the soil, the climate, the animal, the plants, and the interrelationship between them. They build houses with the material that they have. They make utensils, and they prepare herbal medicine, which they use to heal killing them. I was telling in my video, I was telling how Africa used to use leather for like a POP when the ham is broken, to shorten the ham, to allow it to get to allow bones to get joined together. That was long before encounter of with the European. Africa developed a good knowledge of peculiarities of their own environment, how to deal with the weather and how to deal with the terrain. For example, it was in Africa that crop rotation, grain manuring, mixed farming, and the introduction of iron tools, so that hoe and cutlasses and axes were first introduced. African domesticated root crops, so that yam and cassava and cereal grain, so that millet, sorghum, African rice, and cultivated staple food, and was self-sufficient. One of the things that was very clear about ancient Africa was that they were able to produce enough food to take care of themselves. And they only eat what they produce, and they're able to produce abundant of it, that they're self-sufficient. The farmer lives now. They introduced what you call shifting cultivation. It's part of a technique of farming that happened in Africa. Basically, shifting cultivation and forest farming is a technique that is used for farming in Africa. Basically, our forefathers quickly realized that maintaining the soil integrity is more important than the fertility because of the hostility of the weather. Basically, what I meant is this. If you open the soil and you put manure in it, you still lose the soil because then when it rains, the downpour will create an erosion, and when it's not raining, the sun will dry any nutrient you put on top of it. So our forefathers realized that maintaining the integrity of the soil. So what do? They will cut the shrubs and burnt it. And when they burnt it, the burning releases nutrients into the soil, like you put a fertilizer, and also cover the soil. It's like a green mulch. And this allowed them to be able to plant crops on it for a very, very long time. And because they practice crop rotation, they will plant yam on it and plant maize on it, or leguminous crop, and it has planted wheat plant. When they plant cassava, they will plant maize next to it, so that they harvest the maize in 3 months. When they harvest the maize, the cassava will be harvested in 9 months. And so they maximize the land because they know they have a time period of which that land is going to be fertile. And they keep on doing this for 10 years. And after 10 years, they leave the land and allow it to fallow. And they move to another place and start all over again. Now, when the European first came to Africa and the South African region, they saw it as a waste. That these people are very wasteful. They are very... But those that fail to learn from this ancient technique, they pay dearly for it. Let me give you some good examples. The British decided to plant groundnut skin in Tanganyika during the 1940s. And they decided to ignore the way the ancient African way of farming. And they faced spectacularly over 10 years, and it cost them 35 million. It nearly cost, it has a political impact on the British Labour Party of that time in 1940 because of the amount of money that they lose as a result of not following African way of farming. Another interesting experience that happened was in 1970 when the French planted a vast rice cultivation program got underway in the back of the jail in Mali. And that one failed woefully too because they failed to listen to the ancient tradition of Africa. In 1970 as well, the Canadian government committed $44 million to grow wheat in Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania. And the severe erosion, they opened up the land and they plant wheat as nobody planted in Europe. And the severe erosion came and cut in the land, and they lost all the 44 million that they invested in planting wheat in Tanzania. The last example that I'll give is the European was cultivating cocoa plantation in Ghana. We all know that cocoa seed came from the Amazon forest in Brazil. And during the Portuguese were able to master how to plant cocoa. And they set up a plantation in Fernando Po, which is one of the small islands in West Africa. So cocoa was a very high value good during this period. And the British, they wanted to plant cocoa in Ghana, which was a colony of the Great Britain then. And over 100 years, between 1800 to 1870, the British invited many botanists from Switzerland, from Denmark, from Europe, just to come and find a way of cultivating cocoa plantation in Africa. But they failed woefully, and they all went back. Now, there was, in 1870, there was this young blacksmith called Tite Kwashi. He traveled to Fernando Po as a blacksmith to help them to carve out tools that they used for planting cocoa in Fernando Po. And while he was in Fernando Po, he was able to learn how to plant cocoa properly. And because he knew the terrain and the climate structure of Ghana, he was able to combine this knowledge. So after his time in Fernando Po, he traveled back to Ghana with 6 pods of cocoa. And using his knowledge that he gained in Fernando Po and his knowledge about Ghana's weather and soil and erosion and climate, he was able to cultivate plantation. And before you know it, Ghana became the largest cocoa in the world. And just because of the idea of this young one man, His idea was able to generate over $300 billion in Africa over the last 100 years since cocoa plantation started in Africa, West Africa. Because from Ghana, it moved to Nigeria, to move to Ivory Coast and Cameroon, and they've been producing cocoa since then. So what are we trying to say? We're trying to say that Haitian father knew about farming in Africa prior to contact with the European. Their overwhelming dominant activity in Africa was agriculture. And despite its crudeness and simplicity of the tool used for farming, the farmer was good at it, and they were very productive, and they were able to produce food self-sufficiently for them. So good were they that during colonialism, many parts of Africa, the British in particular, they allowed the farmers to use their crude equipment to produce the cash crop. They didn't try to change it because they know that not only is it cost effective, it's very good for African terrain. African in the ancient were able to self-sustain themselves because they plant food that is domesticated, that is suitable for Africa, and they made it their staple food. They didn't depend on imported food like wheat, rice, barley, which did not come from them. So as a result, no African go home without food, and they were not beggars, and they didn't have to import food like we are importing now. What are the lessons to learn? The lesson to learn is that to feed ourselves, we need to develop the food that grows naturally in Africa. Our research institutions throughout Africa need to start looking at what grows in Africa naturally and start doing some research on how to make it to grow productively, to be able to suit our soil environment and our terrain. Farmers, field workers need to go and train farmers how to plant more effectively. Young people need to go into farming and develop and go into farming and turn farming from subsistence farming into commercial farming. Scientists that are being produced, thousands of scientists that are being produced, they need to find a way of adding an engineer that are being produced. They should not just be looking for white collar jobs. They should find a way of adding value to the product that we produce, so that Africa can then start thinking of feeding itself. The scale of farming that Asian African had was one of the reasons why Europeans came to take slaves in Africa. I've just read up with this story. In the next session, we're going to trans-Saharan and transatlantic slavery. But one of the things I want you to know is that when the Europeans went to America and they conquered America, and they discovered there's the largest part of land that they can cultivate, they tried to make the Red Indians to cultivate the land, but they are not used to farming. They are just moving on from they're semi-hunter-gatherer to semi-farmers, and they could not survive. And the Europeans that went saw the size of land, they cannot cope. They haven't got the energy or the tools to be able to cope. So what they did was they realized that Asian Africa are the only people then that use basic tools. They are very good at using basic tools to produce abundant food and cash crop. So that's why they went to Africa and colonized Africa. But in the next chapter, we're going to go into more details. What am I saying? I'm saying this to mean that if Asian Africans are so good in farming, and they're able to self-sustain and produce food for themselves, how come in our time we depend so much on importing food to be able to survive? And anytime we can't import food, we're in trouble. This is our forefathers will be groaning on the ground when they see what we have turned our continent to. And it's about time that we start looking at how to become food sufficiency, how we can feed ourselves. Thank you very much. I'll take some questions.
Heard what you've heard today. Please kindly subscribe to our channel. Kindly subscribe to our channel, and do not forget to hit the notification bell for any new information.